Another concept for attributes is called multi-valued attribute. This is a completely different concept from composite attribute. Multi-valued attribute is simply an attribute that can have more than one values for the same entity instance.
Double oval around an attribute indicates a multi-valued attribute. So in this example, the requirements are, for each employee, we keep track of a unique employee ID and one or more phone numbers.
We have to be careful to distinguish when to use a multi-valued attribute and when not to use multi-valued attribute. If the requirement is that for each employee we keep track of multiple phone numbers and that multiple can vary from employee to employee, then we would use a multi-valued attribute. If the requirement was that for each employee we keep track of office phone and cell phone, then we wouldn't use a multi-valued attribute. Instead, we would simply create two separate attributes, office phone and cell phone. Another concept among attributes is derived attribute. Derived attribute is the attribute whose value is not stored in a database, but it's derived usually from some formula. Let's look at this example. For each entity, we keep track of a store ID and an opening date. For each entity, we also would like to know how many years it was in business. However, that will be a derived attribute. Derived attribute is depicted by a dashed oval. It is derived because we have all the information among stored attributes to derive it. In this case, we can derive years in business from opening date and current date that every computer keeps track of. So we don't have to store years in business. We will store a formula which will say current date minus opening date. It's important to notice that you always choose to depict derived attribute if it's derivable, if you have information to derive it from. Of course, if you don't have information to derive attribute from, then you have to store it. You have to type it in. Let's look at another example of a derived attribute. In this example, we have two entities, store and region. Each store is located in exactly one region. Each region has between one and many stores. Now, when we create a database, we will record every instance of this relationship. Those instances are depicted in the bottom part of the figure. Now, for regions, we want to keep track of a region ID, region name, and number of stores. The thing is that number of stores can be calculated simply by counting for each entity instance how many instances of is located in relationship is that entity instance associated with. For example, East has one instance of is located in. Central has two and West has one. So the formula that counts those instances would be stored in number of stores instead of actually typing those numbers. Next, we cover the concept of optional attribute. Optional attribute is simply an attribute that's allowed to not have a value. For example, for each employee, we keep track of employee ID, salary, and bonus. Not every employee gets a bonus. O means optional. Absence of O means not optional. So every employee must get a salary and every employee must have an employee ID.
As an exercise, you should look at this entity and interpret all of its attributes. This interpretation is also given on page 29. In some cases, the exact minimum and/or maximum cardinality in relationship may be known in advance. In such cases, those exact minimum and maximum cardinalities can be depicted in ER diagrams.
Let's look at this example. Each student enrolls in between 2 and 6 classes. Each class has enrolled in it between 5 and 40 students. So we now know more than just mandatory many on both sides. we know exact numbers. So here we don't have to say each student enrolls in between one and many classes. No, we know exact numbers. So we say each student enrolls in between 2 and 6 classes. Same in the other direction. Each class has enrolled in it between 5 and 40 students. Now, sometimes you get the mixture of specific and non-specific cardinalities. In this case, we see that each student enrolls in between 0 and 6 classes, whereas each class has to have at least 5 students. There is no maximum. It's obviously higher than 5, but it's undetermined. So instead of putting a number in parentheses, we simply put the letter M. Degree of relationship refers to how many entities are involved in the relationship. By far the most common relationship in ER diagrams is the binary relationship between two entities, also known as degree 2 relationship. However, there are other types, such as unary relationship, where only one entity is involved, etc. Now let's look at some unary relationships. Here we have 3 examples of 3 unary relationships. One-to-many unary relationship, many-to-many, and one-to-one. Let's interpret them. The first relationship, example A, states the following. Each client can refer between 0 and many clients. Each client is referred by 0 or 1 clients. Example B, each employee advises between 0 and many employees. Each employee is advised by between 0 and many employees. And finally, the third example is the example of Secret Santa. Each person gifts exactly one person. Each person gets a gift from exactly one person. Sometimes when we create relationships, it's useful, not mandatory, but can be useful, to add relationship roles as a notation to the relationship. This can be particularly useful with unary relationships. Let us re-examine the previously shown 3 unary relationships, but this time with role names added to them. Example A. Each client as a referring party refers between 0 and many clients who are referred parties. Each client as a referred party is referred by between 0 and 1 clients who are referring parties. Example B. Each employee as an advisor advises between 0 and many employees who are advisees. Each employee as an advisee is advised but between 0 and many employees who are advisors. And example C, the Secret Santa example. Each person as a giver gifts a gift to exactly one person who is a recipient. Each person as a recipient is gifted by exactly one person who is a giver. When it comes to binary relationships, role names are rarely useful. In this case, for example, we really don't need the role names. It's clear that each shipment is shipped by exactly one merchant, and each merchant ships between one and many shipments. It doesn't harm anything, but it can be sort of a clutter when it's unnecessary. In this class, feel free to use or not use roles as you see fit. In many cases, 2 same entities can be involved in more than one relationship.
Let's look at this example. There are 2 distinct separate relationships between 2 entities, employee and package. Relationship picks up and relationship delivers. There are 2 separate relationships. In one, each employee picks up 1 or more packages and each package is picked up by exactly 1 employee. And in the other one, each employee delivers 1 or more packages and each package is delivered by exactly 1 employee.